Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you once again by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is a graphic designer who is helping shape the next generation of X-Men comics in House of X and Powers of X. It's Tom Muller. Thanks for coming on, Tom.
Hey, David. Good to be back.
So, we're going to get into House of X, Powers of X, everything like that soon. But, you know, one of the things I was thinking about when I was doing research for this podcast is you are an increasingly big deal in comics. You do a lot in comics. You do a lot of logo work. You do a lot of design work. You're obviously doing a lot for the X-Men books. But you have this whole world outside of comic work that we don't really know much about. And it made me wonder, like, how much of your time is spent working in comics?
That's a good question. I mean, I've always had, like, you know, basically I started working as a kind of graphic designer, art director, creative director over the years, in kind of like what you would call like traditional, like kind of like ad agency world, design agency world. And I still do that to this day. So it's been like around, I mean, I've been working as a professional designer since 1998, and I kind of stumbled into comics around 2001 as a kind of just like as a fun side project, because, you know, growing up I've always been like a comic book reader, comic book fan. I always thought that would be a cool thing to do, like, you know, kind of using design, and because I wasn't really that good or not good enough to be like a professional like sequential artist.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought, yeah, I'll do something, like if I can do something in comics with design, that could be cool. So in around 2001, I started working with Ashley Wood, started doing like some of his logos, started doing his websites, because that was what I was doing most of the time anyway, professionally, still do. So I've always had this kind of rhythm of having a day job and then doing a bit of other design work on the side in the evenings and the weekends. And that kind of like over the years slowly started to grow, and I started to do more work in comics, started to meet new people, made new friends, started working with Ivan Brandon, started working with Alice Cott over the years. And then from 2011, I think, I set up my what was kind of like my side project, turned that into a proper design studio. And then I started doing a lot more comic book work, particularly for Image, then Valiant, then a bit of DC, to this day, really. So I still kind of like, for a few years, I just ran my design company on its own full time. But then I kind of started to go back into kind of like do freelance consulting contracts, which then eventually led back to like a full-time creative director position. So, but I still didn't want to quit the comic book thing. So now I'm kind of like sometimes working double time.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking of, because you're standalone, your independent like design studio. That was Hello Muller, right?
Yeah, it still is.
Oh, it still is. Okay, so you had that, and I know you were working for a big agency over in the UK. And yeah. I mean, my day job is in an agency, and it's like typically especially for a creative director, is probably going to be a full-time job plus.
Yeah.
And then you have because it seems like, I mean, just as an outsider, it seems like your design work is both increasing in breadth and depth. And and that's like, I don't know, I was trying to math it out, and I'm like, does Tom just not sleep anymore, or what's going on here?
I'd like to think that I'm quite good in like organizing myself.
Sure.
But I guess I'm still like, I think because I've got like two jobs, really, I can be very kind of selective in what I take on and what I don't. And yeah, that kind of helps me plan things out a bit. And obviously, like, you know, a lot of the books I work on, a lot of them have like a finite kind of time span. Like they're like finite stories that run for like a few years. The work I do for, say, like DC and Valiant are more a series of single projects. It's like a logo for a book, a cover for a book, and then that's done. Whereas most of the books I do for Image are kind of like long-term engagements where I'm basically like designing everything, every single issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, that definitely makes sense. I mean, it allows you to kind of plan out based off of projects. I mean, it is kind of, I mean,
Yeah.
it is just basically like you're doing agency life, but for comic book companies. So does that make your comic work is more of a luxury? So I mean, in a way, so I guess that allows you, like you're saying, to be more choosy about what you're taking on and allowing you to make sure that it's like a project that fits your design voice.
Exactly, yeah, because I kind of like I'm not that interested in just taking on anything just because it's a comic book, but I'm trying to find, and I'm really lucky with the people that I work with, that we're all like on the same wavelength, and I can like we kind of like gravitate naturally towards each other when it's like about a certain book or a certain look and feel. So that kind of, and it's that age-old rule, like you when you do stuff and you show a certain type of work, that's going to lead to more of that type of work. So that kind of helps to perpetuate that kind of work I do.
Sure. Well, the last broader design question I had for you is,
Yeah.
In regards to, obviously, like as a person who works in an agency, a lot of times there can be a lot of rigidity depending on the client, and obviously some clients are different. But how much does the freedom differ on especially given the fact you work heavily in creator owned or like creator owned adjacent books versus other graphic design jobs, and how much that like does that vary wildly depending on project to project?
I try to kind of look at clients in comics as it's basically the same thing. Like you get asked to design something, whether I'm like designing mobile apps or websites or book covers or like visual identities for companies, that kind of stuff. So it's all like it starts from the same problem. Like we need a design thing. We need something designed for us. Obviously, with all the creator-owned books at Image, there's no kind of like compared to say like the more like the Marvels, DCs, the Valiants, who are very much editorially driven, and they're very, very big companies. So there's a lot more planning that goes into these books that I'm not really privy about, because I'm just one of the tools in the toolkit that these publishers use to basically put together this whole book or series or new IP. Whereas with 100% creator-owned books, the people in charge are the people that are writing, drawing, coloring, the IP itself. So I work directly with those people and have a lot more kind of input into helping shape the whole story, from a design point of view, what the covers look like, what the packaging looks like, what the books eventually look like. So I think if you then want to look at, say, like more commercial, like non-comic book projects, it's kind of like the same thing. You're just like, you're dealing with the client, you're trying to work as closely as possible with that client, but sometimes that client is part of a bigger and a broader system. So they have to kind of be kind of responsible for something that you don't actually have complete control over. So it's the same thing. It's like, different industries will have that same kind of scale of autonomy and kind of responsibility baked in as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's get into the X-Men stuff. I was going to say let's talk about House of X and Powers of X, but it's really just kind of like the broader the X world, the Hickman X world. Yeah.
Yes.
So I want to start with years back on Sketched, I wrote a feature on comic design that featured perspectives from both you and Jonathan Hickman, your X-Men collaborator. Oh, yeah. And when I talked to Jonathan for it, there was this one line that he dropped completely out of the blue that I wanted to bring back because it was funny. It was like, this was 2015, I want to say. And Jonathan said, and I quote, "Want someone to pick up your book? Want some good advice on creating a visual identity? Hire Tom, then go to bed." So clearly he enjoyed your work. I mean, that's something we knew going in. But I want to talk about everything that came before you got to work on these books, and like before we knew about your presence on these books. At what point did Jonathan approach you, and what did he say he was looking for specifically? Because I kind of, I mean, as an outsider, I kind of get the feeling that you, if not the first person he brought on board, you were certainly one of the first.
Um, no.
No. All right.
No, well, no. The funny thing is like we've known each other or of each other for a long time, and we've exchanged emails and like over the years sporadically. But then I think let me think. I think that the whole House of X Powers of 10.
Oh, sorry. I forgot the 10 part.
Powers of 10.
I'm a failure. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's like, yeah, it's quite funny to just like see people as like, is it X? Is it 10? What does it mean?
Well, so you know Hassan Otzman El How?
What's that?
Do you know Hassan Otzman El How? He does panel by panel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I am that special person who, when I first looked at it, called it Panel X Panel. And I was just like, when I had him on the podcast, I was like, he said it panel by panel. I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Anyways.
I think it was announced. Was it the Comic Con in Chicago? Was it
C2E2?
Yeah, I always forget how to pronounce it. Like, which one is it? CEC2 or is it C2EC? Whatever. That's my problem. That's my thing to bear. But when was that? Was that March?
It was March. Yeah.
Okay, so he got in touch in February, start of February, I believe.
Okay.
And it was basically what happened was Brandon texted me saying like, Jonathan asked for your email. He might be in touch. I gave him your email address. He might be in touch. I was like, all right, cool. And then I thought like, I think he still has my email somewhere, but anyway. So then Jonathan emailed me and he was basically like, are you available and interested? I'm doing this X-Men thing. Let me know what if you want to work on this. So obviously I said yes. Then we did like the usual thing, signed all the NDAs with him and Marvel, and then he sent me the whole. He basically sent me the whole Bible for House of 10 and Powers of 10. It kind of like explained to me what the kind of like what the goal is, and then he basically said, to start off, I need a big X. That was it. Because he was, I mean. Because the books are coming out on a weekly basis, they've been obviously working on this for quite a while and to basically get everything up and running and done, because I don't think there's going to be any gaps, and I think everything is pretty much they've been working on this for quite a while, I think. So yeah, then I think at one point Jonathan wanted to like look at the design himself, but he was just completely slammed, obviously, because this is not like a small thing to undertake. And then he wanted to work with me on it, and we kind of like agreed on. I mean, if you've read the House of X issue. Like the design in there, it's like really like it's a blend of both him and I jamming on it together. But that was it. That was how I got involved with the work. And then the first thing he said was like, all right, I need a big X, and yeah, that's the X.
So was that like the entirety of his directions? Like the creative brief was, I need a big X.
Yeah, it was basically that, and then I started like, I think that interview I did with Chris over at Newsarama showed like a bunch of the first designs that I did, and then we kind of like evolved it into like the logo that we have now, because I always wanted to like push it into something new, but then still keep it like recognizable as that's the X-Men X, and it sits in a circle. So we kind of like kept that circle motif, but then everything that sat around it, basically Jonathan was saying like, there's not going to be any like the main brand for the books is going to be the X. The title and everything else that sits around it, that's kind of a second level under it. So it's not that important that has like a custom logo, custom type treatment. It's all about just having that X on the books and that X just standing out on the covers on the bookshelves.
Well, and it's kind of interesting too, and I guess this is just kind of how design works, but it's like you look at the first wave of books that was announced at San Diego, the X, I mean, like from the kind of chopped off corners to the line through the middle of the X to, I mean, just a lot of it really informs the design of, like, that's obviously an element that's carried throughout all the titles, whether you're talking about, you know, X-Men or you're talking about Marauders or you're talking about everything else like that. And it's kind of funny that, I mean, I'm not saying obviously you put a lot of time into making sure this was the right X. I saw the infinity permutations that you did for the X in that Newsarama article, but it became this defining piece for the look of all of the logos going forward. Did you know it would be that going forward at the start?
It kind of like, because the way that the project was running and the way that I had to deliver certain elements at certain times, because we needed that X for the announcement in March, and then we kind of like kept working on. I think the next thing I started working on then was actually like looking at the cover dress for House of X and Powers of 10 and the kind of like the system that we created for that. And then it was, and then I got given the list of titles for, like, you know, the books that were just announced at San Diego.
Right.
And then I basically, you know, a few years ago, Jarrett Fletcher did another kind of line-wide redesign of all the X titles, and he had created this, like, something I still really, really like. He had created that really uniform approach, very clean, where basically every title in the X line had the same used the same typeface, the same X, and it was just like, you know, you walk into a store and you can pick out all the X books just by looking at the type treatment. So that was something I kind of wanted to keep, and you know, just in general, like the type, like, you know, the kind of design work I do, I love to have like a sort of rational system in place and build out like a cohesive visual look. And I thought this was like a perfect opportunity to kind of like go and look at these titles and look at like the whole X-Men kind of franchise ecosystem in the comics and make sure that everything looks and feels the same. So the full alphabet and the kind of like the typeface I designed came out of that one single X. And I just kind of like, you know, broke down the X in like single small components and just used those individual components to then build out individual letter forms and like do 10 different E's or N's and M's, and just to kind of like start putting them together and like make sure that each logo, like if you look at, say, the Excalibur logo versus the New Mutants logo, they all have the kind of like the same base letter shapes, but then they all kind of like, you know, some X-Force has a different E to New Mutants, the N is different on Fallen Angels than to New Mutants, so it's all the same, but each logo has still that kind of like individual character to it. So it's not like I just like typed out every single thing. Yeah,
I totally thought that's what you did, Tom.
Yeah, of course. All right, bye.
Well, I like it. Some of the things that you did with them were really interesting. Like one that stood out to me was like Excalibur kind of felt like it was tilted downwards. Like it was kind of like the top part was facing up, and I don't know. I mean, there's just like a lot of really interesting choices in that. It's funny, I hadn't planned to get to this until later, but I had a patron question about those. Actually, I had two patron questions about those logos in particular. One was in regards to a very specific design studio and whether or not there was somebody that influenced you when you're thinking about this. They're asking about if the Designers Republic, particularly their work on the Wipeout games, influenced you at all on the final wave of, or the first wave of the logos.
Oh, I think I saw someone saying that on Twitter as well. Maybe it's the same person, but not not particularly. I mean, I'm very familiar with the Wipeout games and with Designers Republic because I used to work with them like years ago, like with one of the agencies that I was a partner at. I think that agency at one time we built one of the Wipeout sites.
Oh,
that's going way back, but not especially. It's something like the kind of like the graphic approach I wanted to take with this was something that I had. It's more based on loose sketches and kind of just typeface design ideas that I've had in various sketchbooks, and it just kind of like organically gelled together into this kind of like just organically grew out of that shape of the X-Men X.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another patron question I had in regards to these. Now, this is, I'm going to caveat it first. I know in your Newsarama interview, you said that the X logo was not something that you had developed. You hadn't looked to the past. It wasn't something you did.
Yeah.
With the first wave of the books, did you consider any, the patron was wondering, did you consider any element from the past for these, or was this all new, all different, so to speak?
It was pretty much all new, all different.
Yeah.
I don't think it was ever a Marauders book.
There wasn't. Yeah, they specifically noted that.
No. Yeah. There was a Fallen Angels book, and like all the other books, of course, existed as well at one point. But no, I didn't really look at any of them because I wanted to like build that cohesive look, and then just looking at like all the logo, except for maybe like Jared's design from a few years ago, there was never any kind of uniformity in any of the logos, or I never really. I mean, like the Excalibur logo from the original Claremont and Davis run had this kind of like more heraldic kind of like hinting at like medieval King Arthur, like kind of Britain. But that was something I really didn't want to look at. I think at one point I tried to incorporate like a sword into the logo, but that really didn't work. So yeah, no, there wasn't really anything like that in terms of like references.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that fits into a direction I wanted to talk about, and that's that. Well, when I was researching for this, I was reading an interview you did with Steve Morris at Comics Alliance a few years back. It fits into something that we had talked about the last time you were on the podcast, but you were actually asked about something X-Men related, and within that, it was about those the boxes in the top left corner that show the faces and how they brought those back. Yeah, and within that, you said something interesting, and that was about how essential reinvention is to comics. And honestly, like the funny thing about I have a review that's going up today, the day that we run this, that a lot of it is about how X-Men has long been a franchise that's been stuck in the past. And about how it's always like, it's like even when you look at like X-Men Blue and Gold came out a few years ago, and that was an obvious play to people who loved the X-Men in the 90s. And then those like faces in the corner, that's obviously like playing to nostalgia and everything like that. But was the idea of reinvention a theme of sorts in how you and Jonathan talked about what was happening with this larger X-Men run?
I'm pretty sure it was for Jonathan. I mean, if you read like the interviews that he's been given so far, how he basically said that, just like cancel all the X-Men books and start afresh and kind of put a stake in the ground and say like, look, this is your new X-Men from this point forward. So that idea alone is something that already intrigued me, especially way back when Jonathan and I first started talking about like me working potentially on the books. So yeah, I think it's quite important to kind of to keep things fresh and to keep things interesting. You sometimes have to just, take what works and give it a new spin, do something new with it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like the X-Men logo is still a big X in a circle. That's not something that has. It's not something that necessarily has to be changed, but there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with that idea alone. And then it's just like, it's kind of like my individual tastes and kind of look at design in general, to just go like, look, what can we do to make these logos look new and contemporary, and make them look as this is not something that you would have expected 10 years ago.
Yeah. I think one of the most interesting things from that Newsarama interview you did for me was that, apart from like the non-disclosure agreement you signed with Marvel, you said you were working directly with Jonathan, at least on the X. And I don't know if that continued on beyond that, but that right there, I mean, you worked with DC, and I'm sure you worked directly with DC on that. And with Valiant, I'm sure you worked directly with Valiant on that. But for this, that feels more like a creator-owned project than a typical for-hire gig. And that makes this kind of, just at the jump, a bit of an anomalous project. But did that continue on into House of X and Powers of 10? I was almost adding 10 to House there. But anyways, did that continue on there when you got into the interior pages, or was that just for the X where you were strictly working with Jonathan?
For the interior pages, I was still kind of just working directly with Jonathan, and I was basically Jonathan asked me to look at just creating like templates, design templates, and like just come up with design treatments. So like design elements, like the things like those black bars and those little like corner units. We looked at typefaces as well. So I kind of gave him like this whole toolkit of, these are the fonts that we should use. This is, here's how this page could look like. Here's what, here's a bunch of elements that you can use to like build your pages. Cause I hadn't really seen any of the actual scripts yet. So I kind of like built that whole toolkit. And then at like some point I started to get talking a bit more with Jordan White and Annalise, the editors on the X books, just in terms of like logistics, like the fonts, typefaces needed to be approved by Marvel. They needed to be like Marvel has like licensing agreements with the Monotype Type Foundry, so we had to make sure that everything would kind of like work within those restrictions. But there wasn't really that much, from my point of view at least, creative back and forth between the three of us being like myself, Jonathan, and then Marvel. And then when we kind of like got into the cover designs, then we kind of like everything I shared with Jonathan was also shared with Marvel, and then with the logos for the first wave of X books, then we just kind of like just ping ponged files back and forth with Jordan feeding back, and just kind of like worked it out from there.
Mm-hmm. But it was kind of like Jonathan was the primary client, but you also had like other people having thoughts in there. And that's such an interesting thing for me. Yo, everybody. I want to take a second to talk about my friends at TKO Studios. TKO Studios is a new comic publisher that launched with what the New York Times calls an impressive slate of talent. They publish books by top creators, including Roxane Gay, Jeff Lemire, Garth Ennis, Gabriel Walta, and many more. TKO also does things differently than other publishers. They binge release their books and offer each title in whatever format you most enjoy reading your comics in, whether that's a 6-issue set in a collector's box, trade paperback, or digital download. I'm a single issues guy, so I went that route and I love the collector's box. Even better, all of TKO's first issues are free to read at tkopresents.com right now. So if you're curious, visit tkopresents.com to give them a try, or follow at TKO Presents across all social platforms. And if you're a store that's interested in stocking TKO's books, email retailers at tkopresents.com to learn more about one of the best retailer deals in the industry. And now, back to the show. This is a very dumb question, but I have to ask. I keep trying to come up with the right thing right word, phrase, whatever to call the pages in House of X. Like I was thinking like design pages feels too simple. It almost feels like a narrative infographic, but that feels also not right. Do you have a name for these, or does that not even matter?
I don't know. I think someone at some point called them data pages, and I think that's quite apt because
Sure.
it's basically all this background data to the story. So yeah, data pages.
Let's call it data pages. So with the data pages, this isn't your first time working design into narrative on a project.
Mm-hmm.
You had, I feel like you kind of broke the dam a little bit with Drifter, where it started kind of integrating more into the interior a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Then Motor Crush and Versus, particularly you and Aditya Bidikar were working together to like make those, Motor Crush and Versus both had kind of active elements that were working with the world and everything like that. But I mean, this is obviously not me diminishing what you did on Motor Crush and Versus, but this feels different. This feels like a clear step forward in terms of like overall like delivery of story. It's not just a page element; it's the actual pages. It's the text itself. Does this feel different to you, or is this just me being on my maximum X-Men hype train?
I think. When you look at this issue, the first issue of House of X, and you look at say Jonathan's
like East to
creator-owned books, East to West, or like Black Monday Murders.
Right.
There's a lot of that kind of aesthetic in there as well. Like especially Black Monday Murders, where those kind of designed data pages kind of act as narrative background content, but also as like if you flip through House of X again, it's like every kind of scene or sequence is bookended by a set of data pages, so it acts like kind of like a breaker in the narrative to kind of you just seen like a few pages happening here. This scene has played out. Here's a data spread to kind of like buffer and kind of like pause the reader, and then you're off to like the next scene kind of thing. So in that sense, it's something that Jonathan has been doing in his own books, and I think it's really nice to see this kind of like at this scale in like you can call it. I mean, you can call it for what it is, but this is like a big mainstream commercial superhero comic.
Yeah, it's an event book for all intents and purposes. It's just really interesting because I did a one person focus group last night, which is a brilliant idea because one person focus groups are highly representative. But my wife is an architect and she also does graphic design, and I showed her a pile of comics and I was just like, what stands out? And she like immediately gravitated towards House of X, and like and she was talking about how the title dress or the title dress, excuse me, like on the cover, which just like made the whole thing stand out so much more. She's like, this could be a poster. Like everything else is just like inundated with all these different elements. And then she started flipping through the book, and she was talking about how for her, like the data pages, it helped her kind of like understand what was going on. It was like reinforcing the narrative that was happening in the comic, and she doesn't even read comics. She was talking about how much more appealing that was to her as like an outsider. And it's kind of funny because, and I might have actually tweeted with you about this before, but I remember when Motor Crush first was coming out, and you all were doing, I think it was Motor Crush, you all were doing the little kind of like ads that popped in. It's like, learn more, do this. Yeah. And I remember tweeting and saying like, this reminds me of Starship Troopers. And about how they would have those.
Oh, no, that was Versus, I think. We did these ads in, well, kind of both. I think we started doing those little like pop-up messages in Motor Crush, but then like the proper kind of ads and like product placement things, that's what we did in Versus.
Okay, yeah, it was Versus, yeah. So that was, I remember thinking, I was like, that is like totally like in Starship Troopers when it'd be like, want to learn more? Click here. And then it would go to this weird thing. And with House of X, it doesn't have that active element of like click to learn more, but it is it is really fascinating for me because it does provide that learn more element. Like, you get to this part where you're talking about Franklin Richards, I guess, spoiler alert, retroactive. And then it jumps into a page about Omega mutants and it's explaining all of that. And it's really fascinating for me. But that ties into something that I want to ask about you for a designer in general. It's like, how big of a difference does it make for you as a designer when you're approaching a project from a storytelling standpoint like this, rather than a purely design one? Or is there no distance between storytelling and design for you on any project?
No, I think it's quite important to have that kind of storytelling element into it, and I think that's what for me, that's the nice thing about doing this kind of design work, because you're not just like dressing things up because they need to look pretty or they need to stand out on a bookshelf. But it's especially on those the things that happen inside a comic, is that your design is standing in service of the storytelling, and it's kind of like it helps the creators to add an extra layer to the story. So, for example, like all those kind of TV kind of broadcast graphics that we did in Motor Crush. It just kind of like adds an extra layer to like the whole story, and the kind of like immerses the reader into this whole, okay, they're in a world where there's like an all-pervasive like TV station constantly broadcasting everything. And the same thing in Versus, where you have like these constant ad breaks, kind of like you're pulling in the viewer, like the reader / viewer into these kind of into these worlds, and the design bits are this kind of little extra detail that enriches the kind of like the story and the world that you're trying to pull the reader into.
Yeah. No, I love how it does it. I mean, both in all three of those projects, I think it adds a whole lot to my experience as a reader.
Yeah.
But I did want to talk a little bit about process, because you already mentioned that you and Jonathan with the data pages were kind of ping ponging back and forth on getting it together. What was that process like? Did you start that off, or did he start that off, or how did it kind of all formulate?
I think it started with Jonathan kind of briefing me to like, okay, we're gonna do these data pages. And then we, first I started looking at typefaces, and then we started I started creating some kind of like design templates and just almost random elements, like, graphic elements that kind of like can then be combined into whatever Jonathan would need. So like maybe like just tables and just like those black squares, like black blocks that can have like text in it that can be treated as bylines versus like title treatments, all that kind of stuff. And that was all just like shared to we had like a kind of a group Dropbox folder, so we kind of like just like uploaded files back and forth, and then Jonathan just went away and like started like putting together pages. Then like he would come sometimes ask me like, oh, could you build me this element, or could you do something like this, and then that's kind of like I was just kind of like more feeding into Jonathan, like just giving him all the the tools and the little kits, like it's kind of like a design toolkit really for him to then like put together the story in those data pages, because he designed his own kind of like abstract font that's used throughout the books, and like the colors and the little illustrations and the icons and everything, that's something that he had designed already. So that's kind of like how these our two styles kind of meshed into this thing that's now in the books.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting though, because the data pages are like, comics can already be difficult when it comes to attribution of who did what and where the ideas came from and everything like that, because it's like writer artist is a perpetual discussion, because it's like if a writer writes X and then an artist does Y, what where does that delineation happen, or is there even delineation?
Yeah.
And for the data pages, it's really fascinating because, like you're saying, Jonathan already had a bunch of elements together. You fine-tuned a lot of things. And then this is the weird part for me, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer because you said you defined typefaces. It's like typically words are done by the letterer, and it seems like you did this, not Clayton Cowles, or like not you, but I mean the royal you, as in you and Jonathan, kind of put together the lettering for that.
Oh no, well, but Clayton still did like the lettering on the throughout the whole comic. I mean, it's not.
Oh, even on the data
like,
pages.
No, not on the data pages. That's Jonathan. Yeah, no, it's kind of like it's quite. Those things are kind of separate in terms of like, Clayton always does an amazing job on like the actual lettering of the story, but the data pages, everything that's kind of like, quote unquote a design page,
right,
was put together by Jonathan and myself.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite random parts about the design work in House of X #1 is it's funny how there are little elements, and this, I'm not sure if this is you or it's you and Jonathan. Like there's little elements like in the reading order in the back, where it's like some of the book issues are red, and people are like, "What does it mean?" And then there's other parts which I actually didn't even notice until last night. My wife pointed out when she was flipping through it. She's like, "Why are some of the words slightly underlined on like the data pages? Like on the reading order, it's like TW is underlined." And she's like, "Does that mean something?" I'm like, "I don't know. I haven't thought of that."
I think I'm not sure that means anything, because that's one of the things I did for like little titles, just like kind of like, because if you go on say like the Omega level page, it has the same kind of underline under like OM kind of on the kind of like the data table.
Right.
That's just like, little graphic flourishes.
Yeah.
But yeah, to be honest, I don't know why in the reading order some of these titles are red.
Sure.
I think I know, but I'm
You don't.
I can't.
No. I'm not. I'm not trying to find out. I just think.
No. I know.
Yeah, I just think it's so cool that, I mean, I think that's actually one of the underlying powers of this book is that, and I'm not saying that like the entire point of a comic book is to get people excited about what's next, because obviously the text is important too. But I do think that a lot of what got people so excited about reading about this is it started making them envision what the future looks like, because this book is all about, in a lot of ways, what's next, and like creating an what's next that is more than what we've seen, and that's, I mean, that's kind of that's pretty rare for a Big Two comic, and I like a lot of Big Two comics, but it just felt like a bird of a different feather because of that.
Yeah, but I also think that's like, that's one of the things that Jonathan is really good at, is kind of like building out these like massive worlds and kind of like these massive stories that like, connect a lot of different things and kind of like set a kind of like a grounding for like a lot of stuff to kind of grow out of. So that and that kind of like combined with his eye for design and kind of like designing systems, something that he's always done in like all his books,
right?
That makes it like a really like strong kind of combination, especially in a first issue like that, where it's basically like lots of things are kind of shown at once, but not everyone knows what everything means, and that kind of like, that's good storytelling in my point of view.
For sure. I'm going to put you on the spot right now, not plot wise, but as a designer. Last time we talked, we talked about the idea that you as a designer, when you're kind of walking around the world, you notice things that other people probably don't, because you're just like, oh, why did they do this? This is a terrible design choice, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have a print copy of House of X #1?
I do.
So the page after Damage Control is a similarly colored house ad for Young Guns.
Hang on.
Does that bother you? Because when I flipped it, I was initially confused, because it was like,
oh yeah,
and I was just like, oh man, I feel like Tom, when he saw this, was like, why is this here? No.
No, I mean, that's not really that's not really my responsibility.
Oh, no, no, I'm not saying it's your responsibility. I'm just like, for you as a person who notices design things, because when I was flipping through, it just kind of like messed up my cadence as a reader, and I was just like, oh my god, I wish this was anywhere else.
Well, you could buy the digital copy. There's no ads in there.
I do have the digital copy too, because I have the redeemed one that's in there. But anyway,
It's it's kind of like, it is what it is in my
I
point of view. I mean, there's like, I mean, the ad itself is not bad, but it's this kind of. I think there had to be an ad in there, maybe also to like just flow the story and make sure that everything is kind of like, the double page spreads and the data pages work. So yeah, sometimes it's unfortunate that there's like an ad in there, but yeah,
it is the way it is. Yeah. No, and it makes sense. I mean, if it split up a scene in the same way that the data pages were doing, if it just like randomly threw in something in there that broke up the scene, that would make a lot less sense from a narrative flow standpoint, because like you were saying, like that's one of the cool things about the data pages is they are like bookends on scenes, and they flow into each other because of that. But the last House of X thing I wanted to ask about was, and I emailed with you about this very briefly, but I really love the logo solution for the different books and prints. Like each issue of House of X and Powers of 10 are inverted color wise. Like, so the first issue of House of X is red with a white X, and Powers of 10 is white with a red X. Yeah. And then further prints are the same thing, but just different colors. That is, I'm, like I said, again, I'm not a collector, but there's always like, you have to look at indicia to see, and inside the book to see what printing it is. And it's a little annoying, especially when this book is probably going to have a ton of prints. What made that the right move? Because Jonathan put that one on you. He said this was your solution.
Well, let me think. I don't think that I've seen the second printing cover for this issue, House of X1, and it's the color. The cover color is different. The roundel is the same. It's still the red, white on red. I don't think we're changing the colors of the roundels for, say, second or third printings of a single issue. It's basically issue one. Both issue ones will have a color set. Issue 2, 3, 4, each set will have the same color, kind of like inverted from one another. Yeah. That's the kind of the system I came up with, just because they're. I mean, I think the paperback has been announced as well, and is basically going to be a massive collection of all 12 issues combined.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so I know that, like, both House of X and Powers of 10 is basically one giant story, but they're two halves of the same kind of. And I think once you start reading Powers of 10, it makes sense. I mean, to me, it makes sense why those are two like separate series that kind of like tell a larger story. So in that sense, I thought it made sense to me to kind of just invert each color. So just to kind of show that it's the flip side of the same story, basically.
Right.
It's kind of like the other side of the coin. And then just for the first issue, I thought it was quite nice to use the same colors as the Marvel logo. So it's like white on red. And then for Powers of 10, it's obviously inverted. But then I think the second issue, Powers of House of X2 and Powers of 10-2 is black on blue. I think there's also like a black and yellow design.
Yeah, black and yellow.
I didn't do the full set of 12 in all colors. I just gave like the clean black and white versions to Marvel for them, because I hadn't seen all the art yet. And I think the final issues, both House of X6 and Powers of 10-6, it's just black and white.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you were going to start to run out of color variations there pretty quickly. You're going to have to start getting some oddball neon colors
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stuff.
No.
Um, well, I wanted to ask about, one of my favorite things that came out of our last conversation was the oil tanker
Oh
metaphor.
yes.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure you knew that was coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you had talked about how with creator-owned books, because of it's logic. It's like creator-owned books, they're able to move quicker, they're able to turn quicker, so they're able to get into design choices that are
Yeah.
a bit different earlier. Like you used Black Monday Murders as an example earlier. Jonathan can do that because it's his own book. So it was kind of, he can start rolling out these elements that are in House of X before anything because it's his baby. Whatever, he can do whatever he wants. Marvel and DC, as you noted, were more like oil tankers. They have a tendency of turning a little slower than other publishers when it came to design because they're larger entities. This is a pretty quick turn. Why do you think this massive change happened so quickly? Like, was it just Jonathan, or do you think that, you've been doing more work for DC? Do you feel like that real headway is being made on the design side of comics?
That's a very loaded question. uh, I I don't. I mean, I have not been privy to like all the conversations that Jonathan has had with Marvel, and what the kind of like what the long-term view is for Marvel itself with like the whole X-Men franchise. But I think you as a publisher, and I'm talking about like say the big two now. You would bring in certain creators because you know what they can bring to the table. So I think if you bring someone like Jonathan to the table and ask him, what can you do with this, that he's going to bring everything that he has and everything that he can do to like say this kind of like this franchise. And he's done it before on his whole Fantastic Four run, all his work with Avengers, even Shield. You kind of like
That's part of the Hickman brand.
It's part of the Hickman brand. And then if Jonathan decides to bring me in on it as well, that kind of like that can make a statement and can make for people reading comics that maybe not always stray away too far from say like the mainstream big two. This could be like something new for them to kind of experience and kind of go like, oh wow, I didn't really know that you could do this thing in comics. Whereas in like independent publishing, you can do these things because there's not like it's very much on a case by case basis. Like Versus is not really related to Motor Crush or Snowfall or Zero or The New World. The only kind of connective tissue between those is that I've designed them. But if someone picks up a copy of Saga or The Walking Dead or The Wicked and Divine, and one of the books that I designed, there's no kind of like through line. They all look different. They all have like their completely separate identity. Whereas on say like books within Marvel and DC, they're all part of like a much bigger kind of ecosystem of comics, of kind of stories, how they look, how they're presented to consumer. And I think what DC is doing nowadays, they still have like the corner box on their covers. That's all, I think, designed really nicely. It's like, they've got like this nice little design system going on. What Marvel is doing now with these, what they're doing with the X-Men comics, with Jonathan, I think is really interesting. I'm kind of like seeing what happens next, what's coming out of like, what come October when the line is actually going to launch. Mm-hmm. But to kind of like, I think I see the same thing in like, the design world and kind of like the brand world. outside of comics. I mean, I've been working for like, working for big banks and big corporations and like smaller independent companies, and it's basically the same thing. Like, the bigger the company, the slower it moves into like, pushing change through, because there's so many moving parts that all have to like align and click into place. Whereas if you're like a small independent company, you basically like, there's maybe just one or two people that make the decision. So it goes a lot faster.
Yeah.
So it's not something that's unique to just comic book publishing.
Oh no, I mean, I am constantly beating the drum of like, people are like, oh, this is such a horrible comic book problem. I'm like, this is a problem everywhere. This is something we face. I mean,
Exactly.
but I mean, look at like a great example. I mean, this is obviously a functional thing on top of a design thing, but
Yeah.
look at Twitter. Twitter is a massive company, and then they go through the new design on like the way that the desktop part of their service works, and people lose their damn minds. I mean, granted, like it's annoying at first, but I'm guessing in like 6 months, no one's gonna be talking about it. I mean, probably 3 months, nobody's gonna be talking about it anymore. But at the same time, it's like that's the reason why a lot of these companies don't make changes. Like Coca-Cola doesn't redesign because they've had the same logo. Well, I mean, they've had occasional changes that make people want to light the world on fire, like New Coke and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they stay the same because it's their brand is comfort. Their brand is something you can rely on, and so they become more stuck in their ways. And like there's pluses and minuses to that. Like I don't think many people that are in the branding world are gonna be like, Coca-Cola really needs to rethink their brand.
But they've done, like, I think last year, 2 years ago, they've kind of like rolled out a kind of a rebrand, and I think McDonald's has just gone through a full rebrand as well. But I mean, they keep the golden arches, but it's just like how everything else around it looks. So the packaging is new.
Yeah.
Point of sale interaction is completely different.
Even the franchises.
Yeah. So it's like you can still do these things that seem drastic, but then they kind of blend into everyday life fairly quickly.
Yeah, for sure. No, I just think it's kind of interesting because I like you said, like what's next will be really interesting to see, because and I'm not trying to like put you down a path or anything like that, but this is just my thoughts on it. Marvel has a tendency of reacting to what works. And so it's like, you see the success of something like Squirrel Girl, and then all of a sudden that opens up a door for something like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, and then like a bunch of books that might not speak to their normal audience. Or like Ms. Marvel. Ms. Marvel is another great example. Like Ms. Marvel kind of started off a wave of a bunch of books that they wouldn't normally have published, but now it really fits what they do. And it's what I hope to see, and I'm not saying that I want every single Marvel comic to have data pages, but I do like, I hope that they view this part as part of the success, and I hope that they view all of that to be a value going forward, because it does help. I mean, like my wife is a perfect example of somebody who responds to this type of stuff. She doesn't normally respond to comics, but she looked at House of X for a second. She's like, this speaks to me. Yeah,
but I think that's also, I think this is very specific to this book.
Sure.
And I think taking something that works and kind of build on that and see, what else can we do with this that's kind of similar or sits within that same kind of approach, is only going to work if the actual material is fit for that kind of treatment. I mean, if I'm going to start seeing data pages and say like
Deadpool,
a Deadpool, I don't see that working. That's a challenge for whoever's going to write Deadpool. Make that work,
and unless they do it in a purely comedic fashion.
Me.
Yeah, in a purely comedic fashion, I can imagine, being very sarcastic about it, imagine they could have fun with that. But so last 2 questions about X-Men. First one, this will be quick. Do you outside the logos? You might not even be able to speak to this. Do you have any role in this going forward, or is that kind of the end of Tom for the broader X-Men stuff?
I have one more thing on my plate for this, and that's looking at the paperback trade dress.
Okay.
I haven't even. That's it. I think.
Okay. Then the last X-Men question is: did most people think that your fake House of X billboards were real?
Yes.
Did I just out you?
No. I never made it a secret that they were not real. I think I kind of I mean, the thing is, like, in agency land, those fake mock-ups get used all the time. Every agency uses these. Like, whenever like a design studio launches a rebrand for whatever company it is, if it's like a soft drink company to a TV station, whatever, people make posters and they present them on those fake billboards, on tote bags, T-shirts, whatever. And I thought, let's just run with it, see what happens. And yeah, it was quite funny to see people just going like, "Oh my god, it must be really big because Marvel is spending on billboards,"
Right, right.
kind of thing. And then like people were like, "What is this? Is this a Netflix show? Is this like what is it? Is it movies? Is it comics?" And then I was kind of like, I'm just not going to respond and just like relax, guys. It's just a piece of fun. But it was nice to see the kind of the response and the reaction that it got from people.
I think one of the interesting things about like billboards and things like that, a lot of stuff that's put into the real world today isn't even, I mean, it is designed like Times Square stuff is put up for the idea of getting it in front of people. But I think a lot of times it's almost like designed for social shares as much as anything. It's trying to get people to put it out into the internet world. And that's the funny thing I think about those billboards was it's like you just kind of skip the first step. And I think that the nice thing about it is it just got people more kind of swept up in the excitement about these books. And it was just it was even though it was an inorganic thing, it still felt really organic, and I loved it just because it was like you said, it was one of those things that happens just like all the design stuff and the branding stuff for larger companies. It's one of those things that happens in the rest of the world, but in this case it just doesn't really happen in comics, and it was kind of cool to see.
Yeah, that's exactly why I did those kind of billboard mock-ups, because I just wanted to look at like the kind of like the rebranding that I did for the X-Men, which is basically like, you know, this is the new X going forward until Marvel decides otherwise. But that was kind of like, okay, what would that look like if you take it away from a cover, or like from the kind of the expected places that you see it, and what if I'll make some billboard posters for like, you know, a teaser announcement and see, you know, just post it, see what happens.
Yeah, I liked how you used spaces that were like zoomed in enough that it was like could have been anywhere.
Yeah, but it's also, it was kind of like it was also a good test for me to see, does the design actually stand up if you take it out of like, you know, that little corner on a cover, and does it still have the impact that you want on, say, like an isolated kind of poster format or like on a billboard. For sure.
Well, the last question I have for you is a dramatic shift. I was reading an interview you did this year with Logo Creative, and you were, I found this to be really interesting when I was reading it. You were asked about what bit of advice you would tell your younger self if you could go back in time. And your answer was, there's more to life than reading comics, which is what your dad used to say. And he was right. And I just, I thought that was a really interesting answer. And like, believe me, I understand that if anybody, I am like currently like 6 feet away from a massive pile of long boxes that are like cursing my name because I collected them when I was a child. I'm like, I will never get rid of you, Gen 13 comics, even though I loved you as a child. Why was that your answer? And just how much time did young Tom spend reading comics?
Oh, but young Tom's life was all about comics. I mean, I think that thing, or like why I said that and why I kind of pulled that back into like, you know, what my parents were saying, was that it was because I was, you know, studying design, and all I did was basically reference comic books, like everything I did, like throughout high school, and then like a little bit in college as well, was like every kind of assignment that we had, whether it was about like, okay, make some magazine, make some trade ads for a TV station, or design a book cover for this, or design a logo for a museum. My first port of call was like, let's find a comic book that can kind of like, oh yeah, I remember like there was this issue of, I don't know, Hellboy that has like they're in a library. Let's look at some kind of like panels from that comic and then kind of like adapt it and do my own thing, or just like, the way I was drawing was all referenced from like comic books that I was reading at that time. So my parents were always like, if you want to be like culturally relevant and come up with designs that are actually valuable and mean something, put away those comics and go like, read books on anything, on art, on design, like watch documentaries about nature or history, go to museum, just don't do anything else but just stick your nose into comic books. So that's where that comes from. And I think like, in the long term, I've obviously came to like actually realize that they were right, and that kind of stood me well, I think. And I think it's just like that's a thing that I would advise to like anyone doing anything in kind of like very, very specific creative jobs. That's like, I'm like my main job is very much focused on digital product design, service design, but it's because I have a big, like a track record and experience in doing anything that has like design that has nothing to do with those things, makes my service design and product design a lot stronger, because I can pull from different reference points and different points in culture and design, instead of just referencing other, say, like mobile apps and digital design. So that's where that comes from.
Sure. Yeah, I was just down at a digital conference in Portland, like a digital marketing conference, and the final presentation I went to was fantastic. It was by basically like a visual data designer for Nike. And he did a presentation. He was talking about all the things you need to like think about when you're like doing design and when you're trying to think about data visualization. And a big part of it was like, I think the first 20 steps in his like presentation was basically talking about all the things that you need to bring into your life to become better at recognizing what looks good. And it wasn't just, it was like, basically you can't just look at other, way that people visualize data. It's like, read books, read magazines, like,
exactly.
It's like, look at different, like font packages, look at different, like all these different things you can look at, because it's, and people say that in comics too. It's like, if you're a writer, don't just read comics. You have to read other things, because that's the fuel that's going into your brain to define your own voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought that was really funny, though, because you also talked in another interview I read that you were talking about how your dad was, I believe, the person who got you into comics. And I'm like, you're sending real mixed signals, Dad. What's going on?
Well, he was more, he wasn't really into comics. He was more into like into sci-fi and like literatures, but he kind of like he gravitated very heavily towards that kind of fiction in that kind of storytelling. So I guess when I was a kid, comics were kind of like the natural extension of that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, it is. I was also, when I was reading those, I didn't actually realize that your parents were both interior designers, and I think your grandfather was an architect.
Yep.
And like that's
my uncle's an architect as well.
What's that?
My uncle is an architect as well, and my brother's a 3D designer. So
you have a very designy family, but I mean, that's really, I mean, that's kind of awesome, because it's, I don't know. It's interesting to see like how that can happen with some families where there's a common interest amongst those. Like my my wife, she's an architect, her brother's an architect, but they have absolutely no, like her father was a judge in the Air Force, and mother was a mother. And so it's like, it is kind of interesting how those types of things can feed down the line in some situations and not in others, but I don't know. But either way, Tom, thank you so much. That's all I have for you. Thank you for coming on and talk about all the X-Men things you can talk about, and maybe some of the things you can't, and then design and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
It was my pleasure, David.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with designer Tom Muller. You can find him on Twitter at HelloMuller, on his website at HelloMuller.com, and his work in comics like House of X and Powers of 10. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all of the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Nathan House, Litwin Studios, Alex Dimitropoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Liana Kangas, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Connor Farner, Vita Ayala, JDC and Matt Gagnon, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Knoll, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Chipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Heifeld, Nicholas Gardner, Fiona Staples, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.